Well, Peter Hitchens, thank you very much indeed again for your time. We're in London this time.
Yeah.
And talking of London, you recently wrote this. John Cleese, very well known in Australia, is condemned for saying an obvious true thing, that London is no longer a British city. Of course he is, you said. One of the things that makes it un-British is that speech is no longer free there. What did you mean by that?
Well, the speech is no longer really free in this country. There are places, I have freer speech than most people because I have the great good fortune to be a national newspaper columnist with occasional access to broadcasting. And therefore, it's to some extent, I'm paid to speak freely. But anybody who works, particularly in the public sector, or anybody who works for the public sector or in politics, lives under a constant threat of being destroyed, perhaps in a Twitter storm or perhaps simply because they've said something which a colleague regards as in some way incorrect. And the great enforcement of speech controls in the modern West is not done in the crude, protestable, old-fashioned way of sending people to prison for saying the wrong thing. It's done by threatening their employment, and so threatening their livelihood and threatening their family. That's what keeps people in line. In any workplace, particularly, and on an awful lot of broadcast networks, a single slip into a breach of speech codes, and that's the end of you. Goodbye. So we don't have free speech here. And that's been has accompanied the huge revolution in this country, which really got going once the Berlin Wall collapsed and the left escaped from their association with the Soviet Union and began to mount the enormous long march through the institutions which has taken place, which was accompanied by a huge amount of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism was embraced, not because people particularly loved the new cultures which they were welcoming into our country, but because they didn't like the culture which they wanted to replace, and they saw this as a very good way of doing it. And therefore anybody who complained about multiculturalism would be falsely accused of doing so because of racial bigotry. And once you've been accused of that, then you've had it anyway.
The conflation of race and culture seems to have got us into a situation where the most appalling epithets are thrown at people to silence them, and the cost is reasoned and rational discussion.
Yes, but the people who are engaging in this, in many cases, don't particularly want reasoned or rational discussion. They just want to silence opposition to what they're doing. And the extent to which they know what they're doing and the extent to which they do it instinctively is always a difficult question to resolve. My own view as a former Marxist-Leninist is that there is a large number of people now in the media elite, in the political elite, among the lawyers in the academy, particularly in broadcasting and also in the schools, of people who quite consciously in the 1960s and 1970s embraced a revolutionary position. Now, they didn't, when they went off and went to work and became employed, they didn't continue to be, for instance, members of or sympathizers of Trotskyist sects, but they didn't give up their revolutionary views. And they turned them into cultural change, because that's how revolution actually proceeds in the modern world. There's two things which have changed hugely in the past 50 or 60 years. One of them is warfare, which is certainly in advanced countries very seldom now conducted by invasion, and almost always conducted by subversion of the regime by people power and other means than that. And the other is revolution, which is no longer conducted by a seizure of the railway station and the barracks and the police station and the telephone exchange, but by a seizure of the university and the school and television studio and the newspaper office. And that's how it's done. And these people fanned out from their universities and their colleges of education at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. And they, sometime round about the 80s, they began to reach positions of importance. And then in 1997, they finally achieved what they'd really been dreaming of for a very long time, which was a government in this country which was sympathetic to them. And that was the moment of revolution. Since then, since 1997 in this country, there has been an extraordinary, accelerated charge towards a transformation of almost every aspect of our society. I'm always amazed how few people can see it.
Can we then see Brexit in terms of what David Goodhart talks about, the anywheres who overwhelmingly in an age like this one have been through universities? Astonishing numbers of people now go through universities, where for years they're really drip-fed a very narrow diet of politically correct worldviews, if you like, very little contestability of ideas, very little thinking through. Now, those people have had their hands on the lever for a long time.
Yes, they have.
And whereas those who still subscribe to a more traditional view of how Britain should be feel disenfranchised, feel left out.
They do.
So you've got a deep chasm.
But their disenfranchisement, as with the similar people who voted for Donald Trump in the United States, is incoherent. They don't really, alas, understand the nature of what it is they're against. They're a disparate coalition, often of long-term Labour voters who have for many years disagreed with and been suspicious of their party's policy on mass immigration, for instance, but who've never had, because they've been loyal to their party, have never previously felt free to vote against it. The thing about the referendum was it dissolved the party bonds and party loyalties and allowed them to vote differently. So they were a very large part of it, and they came into a wholly unprecedented coalition with large numbers of conservative voters who felt similarly and had also been let down by their party. And that was a very big part of it. But there's also another thing, which is economic decline and the fact that huge numbers of people in both political tribes in this country no longer feel that tomorrow will be better than today, and are very tired of being told that the recession is over and that things are getting better when they see all around them the closing of shops, the closing of workplaces, and particularly in large areas of the country, a very, very sharp and noticeable decline in the quality and availability of public services from transport to health. And they feel it, and it was a protest against all kinds of things. Eventually someone will write the book and do the work. I don't know quite how many things were involved, but oddly enough, probably British membership of the European Union was one of the minor issues involved in that, in the referendum. It was a convulsion, what Lenin would have called a festival of the oppressed, of people finally able to register a protest against all kinds of unwelcome changes in their lives, which they had for long been complaining about and which nobody had paid any attention to.
Where did we lose? What as an Australian I would have seen as something that Britain's given to the rest of the world, including my own country, respect for one another and an understanding of the importance of civility. And by civility I don't mean a niceness. I actually think of it as a tough-minded virtue, where sometimes, through gritted teeth, you have to engage with ideas that you do not like at all, but if you don't engage with them, you can't find your way forward. Where did it... You can talk the Frankfurt School, you can talk Gramsci, you can talk about what happened after the collapse of the Berlin Wall that you did, but where was the tipping point in Britain where civility started to be thrown over?
Oh, well, the tipping point of all these things, the moment in modern civilization equivalent to the fall of the Roman Empire was the First World War. And the damage which that did to the whole Anglosphere was permanent. Also, the shift in power in the Anglosphere away from Britain and towards the United States, which was already taking place, hugely accelerated in a way which was, I think, quite damaging for both countries. And that's the root of almost anything you care to name, it seems to me, in the modern world. I can't find a more easily established and evident moment at which everything began to go the wrong way. It's Paul Cambon, who was the French ambassador to London for many years, both before and after the First World War, reckoned that in 1918 that Britain had undergone a revolution as considerable as that which his own country had undergone in 1789. And I think he was quite right. But the thing is, it was never acknowledged as such. We carried on with the outward forms. I'll say this, it may disrupt your timings, but last night I had the news that my good friend Christopher Booker had died. And he was always very keen on mentioning Kierkegaard's great statement about revolutions, that the most effective ones were those which left the buildings standing and all the apparent outside characteristics of society still seeming to be there. but inwardly everything had changed. And so people couldn't really understand that a revolution had taken place, and yet they lived in a society in which a revolution had taken place. And that's been the position, particularly of this country, but of course of all the countries which it influences politically and culturally and morally, ever since really 1914. And most particularly, almost exactly 103 years ago, the Battle of the Somme in 1916, when we threw away the flower of our manhood in a few days.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.